p.m. I would respectfully ask everyone attending the meeting to mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please note that the committee hearings of the RTD Board of Directors will be held remotely via Zoom and will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with the unofficial meeting minutes of the board meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable from the board's website. Visit rtd-denver.com, and a live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. Directors and members of staff, for the sake of the record, if you would like to be acknowledged during tonight's proceedings, I would ask you please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call on you before proceeding to speak. Directors and staff participating by phone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate that they would like to speak by pressing *9. To toggle your mute setting on your phone, press *6. I would now like to call the roll for the committee. Director Catlin.
Here.
Director Davidson.
Here.
Committee member Brendel. Committee member Ohlenberger.
Here.
And I am here. We have 4 committee members present, which is a quorum. I do not see any other directors present. I'd like to open public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic listed in the published meeting agenda for the current and immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and have not already done so, please raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. Are there any hands?
There are no hands raised at this time.
Thank you, and no comments were submitted to the board office. With no participants in the queue, we will close public comment at this time. There is one recommended action on the agenda. That action is for the 2022 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report and Report to Governance. And I will turn that over to Doug McLeod.
Thank you, Chair DeShell. Good afternoon. Yes, this is the requested action item to accept the 2022 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report into the RTD records, as well as the single audit, which is the audit of federal awards. Joining me today is Pam Hill, partner with Plant Moran, and Chris Gilbert, manager with Plant Moran. I'd like to thank you both very much and your teams for all the work that you've done and guiding us through some of these new GASBs. I know they've been tough for us to undertake. And along with that, I really want to thank Byron Ayton, who's our senior manager of accounting. He and his team did a lot of extra work this year, along with Plant Moran, just due to these new pronouncements that have come out. But with that said, I think, Pam, you're going to present a few slides to us. So take it away when you're ready. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Chris is going to share his screen here. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here this afternoon on a Friday afternoon. Who doesn't want to talk about audit, right? So we will make this as short and sweet as you would like it, but we definitely do want to cover the results of the audit and just talk a little bit about the process here. So Chris, if you don't mind going to the first slide. So overall, here's all the deliverables that you should have included in your packet in what you hire Plant Moran to provide. We did spend over 1,100 hours this year auditing these various reports, including the financial statement and single audit, as Doug had mentioned, as well as several other reports. So as you noted in your packet, you did have the annual comprehensive financial report or the financial statements. We did provide our audit opinion on those financial statements, which was once again an unmodified opinion, the highest level of assurance you can receive from your auditors. Also included in there was the end of audit letter. I think probably what's most important maybe to all of you is what's not included in this end of audit letter, which we did not have any findings related to internal controls over financial reporting at RTD. So that's great news. Your team continues to do a great job. And with that, I do kind of want to echo Doug's comments. Really want to thank Doug, Byron, and the entire team. The amount of time we spend is a lot, but your team spends even more time getting ready for us and then answering all of our questions and stuff throughout the audit. So we really appreciate all the effort given by your team to help make the audit go as smoothly as possible. We did also have the federal awards audit or single audit report. Again, happy to report no findings there. And Chris is going to talk in a few slides just on some of the numbers related to the federal spending at RTD this year. Then we also do perform 2 agreed upon procedure reports related to National Transit Database reporting, and then some procedures related to the general manager contract as requested by the board. So both of those have been provided to RTD, and actually earlier than the financial statements this year. So we've had those finalized for a little while here. So on the next slide, I just want to touch briefly on some of the risks that we identified at the beginning of the audit. So if you recall, prior to the audit starting, we have a conversation with the audit committee. We talk about what our plan is for the audit. So these next few slides are really going to take us through the results of what our plan was. And if we had to deviate from our plan, we would talk about that here. I think what you're going to find really on most of what the next few slides says is that we carried out our plan as we had communicated to you back earlier this year, and we didn't need to deviate from the plan. So you'll notice that we really focused on GASB 87. And again, Chris is going to talk a little bit about that process a little more in a few slides. And then also on the COVID funding. And we are happy to report that we didn't have any findings as a result of the additional procedures that we performed related to those risk areas. So Chris, if you want to flip to the next slide, there you go. Thank you. Also, we do talk about the fact that we are expressing an opinion based on professional standards. And I know we talked about the fact that, we use materiality and a risk-based approach throughout the process. So we don't look at every transaction that occurs at RTD during the year. And we're happy to report we didn't note any transactions that were entered into during the year that lacked authoritative guidance or consensus in terms of how those should be reported in the financial statements. And then on the next slide, there are a few significant accounting estimates included within the financial statements. And again, Chris is going to touch on the pension liabilities in a few slides, but obviously those are just one big estimate. So based on a lot of different factors, including market, mortality tables, and the like. So we do spend time auditing those assumptions to make sure that they seem reasonable and in line with plan provisions, and then also obviously the useful life of your capital assets. The only new accounting policy was GASB 87, and we did have one past adjustment. This adjustment's been similar for the last several years, and it's just a disclosure related to the 401A retirement plan and the money weighted rate of return. And then we did date our opinion letters all on June 27th, so a few weeks ago. And then Chris, if you want to turn to the next slide, I am going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Pam. So I'm going to pick up on some legislative and informational items. So we always like to include this in our letter and our presentation to you, just some relevant legislative and informational items that we believe will be of interest to you. So a couple of highlights here. So in the ACFR, there is a calculation of net investment and capital assets. And this first one right here is just a little more informational and just a reminder that the new GFOA requirement for the certificate of achievement, and the new requirement was effective last March, but it essentially requests that the district includes the calculations of the net investment and capital assets report on the statement of net position as part of the submission package that's sent each year to the GFOA. So just a reminder there. The next one is regarding cybersecurity. So as you all are well aware, this continues to be a hot topic, and with all the services that RTD provides, including rail, among others, this is just something that RTD is going to have to continue to focus on, just to continue to meet FTA requirements and just really to protect against all cyber risks. And with that, we just encourage you to continue to just work with your technology team on this and really just let us know if we can be of any additional assistance. And then, as Pam mentioned earlier, GASB 87, this was a new accounting standard that was effective for fiscal year 2022. So this new standard at a high level gave guidance on the identification and reporting of lease activities. So this really did have a significant impact on RTD. And the ACFR does include several new disclosures in the footnotes. There's also a new lease liability and lease receivable on the statement of net position for lease activities. And that's where RTD is either the lessee or the lessor. So the additional disclosures and line items on the statements are really a result of the culmination of a significant amount of time that the RTD team put together months before the audit and throughout, just reading through several agreements, doing research, performing calculations, and really consulting with us. And we spent a lot of time auditing the conclusions reached. So we definitely appreciate Doug and Byron and their team's efforts in just implementing this standard and all the work that went forward with this. This year of implementation is certainly the most involved, but we also want to stress the importance of implementing ongoing monitoring procedures over lease activities, just to ensure that there's a process in place to identify and appropriately account for new lease activities or changes to existing lease agreements on an ongoing basis going forward, at least on an annual basis, just to ensure any new lease agreements are captured. You got a good foundation here with all the conclusions that were reached this year. So just going forward, as you enter into new lease agreements and as any existing agreements change, you'll just want to make sure to keep up on that. And then at the end of the audit, end of audit letter, we always like to have upcoming accounting standards. So what's on the horizon? So we've included all of the upcoming accounting standards in that letter that may potentially impact RTD in 2023 and going forward, including GASB 96, which that one does have a lot of similarities to GASB 87. So we do have toolkits and resources that we've already forwarded to your team, but we will continue to work with your team to help implement that new standard and any others that will be applicable to RTD going forward. So with all the new accounting standards released in the past several years and looking forward, you're in the same boat as many others in the industry where you have the same amount of people and there's just more work and responsibilities and financials. And the financials continue to get more complicated and cumbersome. So, and obviously, we obviously are here to help as well with the team to implement those standards. So really quick, I'm going to cover some legacy costs. And the first one is for the ATU pension plan. So this is showing the last 5 fiscal years. And as you can see here, at the very bottom for the fiscal year we just audited, the unfunded liability for the plan was just under 250 million, which is about 55% funded at the end of the fiscal year. So the percentage has been trending up in terms of the percent funded. One thing we did want to point out here was that these numbers are at a specific point in time, and these are actually on a 1-year lag. So for example, the 12/31/22 fiscal year that we're reporting on right now, at the bottom is really as of 12/31/21. And that's because the measurement date based on the actuary and what the district elected is a year behind. So with that being said, we know that there was a one-time $160 million contribution made in early 2022. So because of that 1-year lag, that large additional contribution is not yet being reflected here. It's going to be reflected in the plan's net position next year. So we also know that the market was down in 2022. So again, that actual activity that happened in 2022 won't be reflected until 2023 because of that 1-year lag. So with that being said, even though the market was down in 2022, because of that large additional contribution, we would expect next year the plan's net position and the percent funded to increase substantially from the 55%, if that makes sense. And then jumping to the salaried employees pension plan. So this slide has a very similar concept, so I'll spend a little time on here. So similar to the ATU plan, the salaried employees plan is on a 1-year lag. So 12/31/22 is really 12/31/2021 plan activity. So, and obviously this is not reflecting the market being down in 2022 as a result, but regardless, at the end of the year, at this point in time, the percent funded ended at just under 84% with an unfunded liability in this particular plan of about 29.7 million. And then moving on to the last slide here, and then we'll address any questions. As Pam mentioned before, this last slide does show a trend analysis for the past 5 years, and it's really total expenditures of federal awards that RTD receives. So this is essentially the total amount on your CFA each year. And we include this slide really to discuss total grant funding and how much you're spending, as well as how much of it was COVID funding versus regular transit funding spending. So as you can see here on this slide, fiscal year 2022 total expenditures of federal awards was just under 300 million, which is pretty well in line with fiscal year 2021. Over 99% of this amount in 2022 was related to the federal transit cluster from the US Department of Transportation. And then also about 208 million, or nearly 70% of this spending, was from COVID-19 funding related to ARPA funds. So you'll notice here in the middle, the reason 2020 was so much higher was really because of the Transportation Infrastructure Finance, or TIFIA program. And that was about 340 million extra in federal expenditures that had been awarded, federal expenditures of those funds in 2020, and that makes up most of the difference. So if you take that out, it's been pretty consistent the past 3 years for the federal transit spending. So I know we just threw a lot at you. I guess that's the last slide that we have. So any questions on anything Pam or myself have covered so far?
Pardon me, Mr. Chair. This is Melanie Snyder, General Counsel.
On the other side, please proceed.
Thank you. So before we start any discussion, could we just get a formal motion and a second on the record to adopt the ACFR?
I move that we adopt the ACFR.
Second.
Thank you. I see a first by Director Catlin and a second, I believe, was Director Davidson. Mr. Ellenberg, I see you have your hand raised as well.
That was for another question, but we can move on with this first, if that's the correct order.
I think we're open for discussion now.
Yeah, please proceed.
Okay. I'll go ahead since I had my hand up there. Just on the pension funding, is there a place that we want to be, or a best practice in terms of percent funded for the pension plan? And is it a concern that the union pension plan is at 55% while the salary is at around 80? So
maybe I'll say something really quick, and then Doug, maybe if you want to jump in on the union plan. So I think in dealing with different plans throughout the country, a good benchmark is being in that 70 to 80% funded range, because you're always going to have years where maybe you fluctuate above or below. And so the salary plan obviously is right, in that sweet spot. And I will let Doug maybe touch on the ATU plan and kind of the things that RTD has done, as Chris mentioned, to get that funding percentage up. So Doug, if you want to maybe take that.
Thank you, Pam. Yes, and it's a great question. The ATU plan was actually as low as 35% funded a few years back. So we really had some concerns about that plan. And up to that point, essentially what was happening is RTD was making contributions according to the collective bargaining agreement. That was the only contributions that RTD was making, and the employees made their 5% contribution. There were some market swings, and the big thing was that the contributions weren't enough to keep up with the benefits being earned. So with the 2022 through 2024 collective bargaining agreement, the ATU and RTD agreed to close the ATU pension plan to new employees. And along with that closure, RTD contributed a lump sum of $160 million, as Chris had mentioned. If you just do the straight math on that without the actuaries involved, it puts that plan above 80%. Because that plan is closed now, as is the salaried plan, it's really a tail off in benefits to where it eliminates a lot of that financial risk to RTD. And then in place of the ATU pension plan for new employees that hired January 1st of this year, 2023 and beyond, any represented employees would now participate in a new defined contribution plan.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions, Director Davidson? I think I saw your hand. Oh, it is still up.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. One question I have, and first of all, thank you, Plant Moran, for all the work on this. Always great to see no findings. That's great. And Byron, Doug, thank you for the work. It sounds like this GASB 87, massive impact, particularly on the debt side. I'm curious, and this may be more a question for Doug and your team, but also from Plant Moran, did this impact how we account specifically for our certificates of participation? And did anything materially change in our accounting around the COPS?
Thank you, Director Davidson, excuse me. And I'll ask Pam and Chris to supplement my comments, but essentially what it did is the private sector actually preceded under FASB, Financial Accounting Standard Board pronouncements for the private sector. GASB is Governmental Accounting Standard Boards, implemented pretty much the same standard for government agencies. And what it did is operating leases, so a lease that's treated as an expense as opposed to like a long-term lease of a capital asset, which is more of a capital lease. Those operating expenses were already flowing through the financial statements. Then capital leases weren't on the balance sheet. They were essentially shown as future commitments in a footnote. So what GASB 87 did was essentially put the asset and the liability on the balance sheet for any of those capital leases. So in my opinion, it really just had the effect of grossing up the balance sheet, and it wouldn't have any impact on the certificates of participation or our debt. It's included in our debt essentially, or I think it's in our other long-term liabilities on our balance sheet, but it's not necessarily debt per se. Pam, Chris, anything to add to that?
No, I would agree, Doug. I mean, I think it basically was the big gross up of the balance sheet, and it changed the definition of a lease. So as Doug stated, there used to be two different types of leases, and it basically just completely changed the definition. And it maybe scoped in some things that you wouldn't have even thought of as leases in the past, which is why I think it took so long, because obviously you're a very large organization and you have a lot of contracts. So just to make sure there's not any underlying leases in some of those contracts was a lot of work. But yeah, I would agree that from a income statement perspective, the impact was very minimal. But it was mainly a kind of a gross up of the balance sheet.
That makes sense. Quite the lift. Thank you to the team for that lift. Thank you. That's very clear. Mr. Chair, if I may, just another question. Unrelated, and I know this goes a little bit outside the scope of the audited financials, but Chris, I just noted that you paused in the legislative items and considerations mentioning information technology and cybersecurity considerations, and you made a note of just encouraging the agency, to have an eye on this. Were there, I know, no findings in the statements, but were there any observations that you had, in looking at our expenditures or anything about our agency that brought you to say that, or was it more just a general comment? Basically, anything specifically noted with respect to RTD? So I think so. That's a great question. And I know Doug and team are well aware, but there's been some additional requirements from the FTA related to cyber, and the reporting requirements, assessments, and things like that. So it's a much more hyper focused lens on it in the transit space.
especially in the rail space, because if someone were to hack into that, the impact it could be catastrophic. So, we mainly bring it up because it is something that has been a more recent, I don't want to say mandate, but requirement of the FTA, just related to the reporting and the items that need to be done. And I'm sure, and Doug, you can speak to this probably more than I can, but I'm sure your team's all over what those new requirements are and needing to do it. But that's mainly why we bring it up, because it is a relatively new thing that has come through from the FTA.
Okay, understood. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think as we continue on some of our internal audits, just to appreciate the additional clarity on why that was noted here by you all. Yeah, thank you. This is great. The final point I just would make, I'm encouraged to see that there were no findings, especially as this was our chance to really get a look at the CRISA and ARPA and CARES funding, which was one time, unusual, different. Still, I think a lot has changed with that funding, with there being the clawbacks being discussed, granted with the carve out being for transportation. But I think the only other question I have there, and again, Mr. McLeod, this may be for you, is are we fully past now, any of the risks associated with both expending the funds, accounting for the funds? I know this was a bigger lift this year and looking back at how those were done, but just where are we in terms of both spending and accounting for what was pretty unprecedented levels of one-time funding?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Director Deschella. And certainly that was a fantastic thing for RTD, because sales and use taxes at the same time were growing. So what we were able to do is basically, because of that additional funding, bank more of our sales and use taxes into investments. And investments, it was actually good timing, because in the investment returns that we're getting are 4 to 5% on U.S. Treasuries, and we're limited to the types of investments we can do. So they have to be safe, which is basically U.S. Treasuries and U.S. agency securities. So we've been maintaining a balance of a little over $1 billion in cash and investments ever since we drew the remainder of those funds. And I don't see that deteriorating in the midterm financial plan that we will bring to the board in September. Part of that money most of that money, additional money, is so far earmarked for state of good repair items that need to be caught up. We've got some significant items out there with most of our rail infrastructure coming up on 20 to 30 years of age. So I do anticipate much of that money to be spent, but not to the point where it would threaten our reserves per our fiscal policy. So, I would say we're in very good financial shape because of that. I would add that we did draw all of the CARES, CRISA, and ARPA money by the end of last year, 2022, with the exception of $53 million in supplemental ARPA funding. That $53 million was from a prior midterm financial plan in which we showed a gap of $53 million over actually it was closer to $60 million over the 6-year period. So we applied for supplemental ARPA funding, received that approval, and just Byron's team just drew that down at the end of May. So we've drawn all of the COVID money that's been apportioned to RTD. Our whole intent along the way was to draw it as quickly as we could so we could get it invested and earning some money. We're on pace to earn about $30 million in investment income this year. In recent past years, it's been single digit millions, just because interest rates were so low. So I think we've gotten a double good impact from that funding there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, great moves. Well, yeah, all good moves. And I know we made some smart moves at that. So again, glad to see no findings on the accounting of that and the drawdown of that last year. That's awesome. Awesome work. Thank you so much, that Mr. Chair. That concludes the questions that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Ellenberger.
Thank you. So I had a question on, I noticed that there was a decrease in fare revenue in between 2021 and 2022 because of the free fare for better air. And I noticed in 2023, we're doing 2 months of that instead of 1 month. So this is kind of a half financial question, half operational question. Is the drop in fare revenue completely offset by, I understand it's state funding. I think the financial statements actually said that's yeah, we had a decrease in fare revenue, but it's offset by increase in a grant from the state or state funding. Did that completely offset it? So that's the financial question. And then, it's branded free fare for better air. Is that the only intent, or is there also, we're also trying to increase ridership? And if we are trying to increase ridership and awareness of the system and public transit, are there things that we're doing to monitor that and see if that free fare for better air, if that program is effective in trying to increase ridership that, as we all know, dropped significantly since COVID?
Mr. Chair, this is Doug McLeod. I can take that.
Yeah, please proceed.
Thank you. Yeah, very good question. So the way we accounted for the 2022 Zero Fare for Better Air grant funding was, as you said, it shows a drop in fare revenue in 2022. RTD received $7.4 million from the Colorado Energy Office under that grant. We recorded it as grant funding, so it doesn't show up in the fare revenue, which is why that drop is apparent there. And regarding offsetting, so we had budgeted $9.2 million for that month. And we'd actually over budgeted our fare revenue throughout 2022, not knowing coming out of 2021 what we expected more of a return of ridership during 2022 at the time we put together the budget. That did not materialize. So if you were to look at the trend in revenue by month, that $7.4 million is pretty close to what our monthly trend was. So I would say, yes, it did replace. However, we did see a fairly large increase in ridership, although we did not add service. We added a few extra cars to trains, but didn't actually need them. So we didn't incur a lot of extra costs for that Zero Fare for Better Air period during 2022. So I would say it was pretty much a wash. By the way, that Zero Fare for Better Air grant was 80-20. So it was 20% local contribution by RTD and 80% was covered by the CEO grant. This year we'll be doing the same thing, or we are doing the same thing in July and August. So it's a 2-month program. And I don't remember the full amount of the grant. I want to say 12 million, may have been, I think it might be 15 million actually, 15 million. And that is 100%. So it's not an 80-20, it's 100% covered by the CEO grant. I anticipate that to fully cover the grant funding, and we don't anticipate additional expenses other than some marketing campaigns, which were on the order of about $236,000. So I think we'll be in pretty good shape. Last year, we did see about a 20% increase in ridership. I guess we haven't really built any expectations about what would happen this year, but we would anticipate an increase in ridership again this year, similar to last year. Don't know what that looks like yet. We're only a few days in, and the way we gather ridership, it takes about 2 weeks after month end to actually get all the automatic passenger counter data in from all of our vehicles that are out there roaming around. So we'll have a pretty good idea at the end of or middle of August how July went, and then same thing the following month. And what we did last year is provided a report to the CEO office that just spoke of our experiences and also the ridership impacts that occurred with the Zero Fare for Better Air program. We anticipate putting together some of that information again this year based on those results as well. And it includes things like incidences, security and safety incidences that may have occurred as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and when you talk about the 20% increase in ridership, is that just during Zero Fare for Better Air, or is that continued ridership after the program ended? And do you have a number for increase in ridership, if any, after the program ended?
That's a good question. And one of the difficulties we have is making those comparisons, because essentially it was a 20% increase in ridership from July to August, but we also noticed some seasonality in our ridership, especially during the recovery or as we emerge from the COVID impacts to ridership. So we couldn't completely put our fingers on how much of that was new riders versus, just people using it more type of thing, or our normal customers. There's also seasonality because of summer where we have students writing. So you go from July into August, it changes the paradigm there a little bit. So yeah, I think generally speaking, we did see that it popped up a little bit in August, and as you go into September last year, you would see it. It was August last year, and then you go into September, and then school comes back in session. So it's really kind of tough to compare on a trended basis. But we have seen our ridership kind of steadily maintain at that 60% of pre-COVID levels ever since that time. So I wouldn't say it was a big bump and then it sustained. It was kind of a big bump and then it flattened back out to 60%. And I would say it was up, in the 65-70% range during Zero Fare for Better Air last year.
And I think, did the financial statements say that it was at 40% of pre-COVID levels? So, I mean, are you saying that now we're at 60% of pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, sorry, and it wasn't a jump in 1 month. It was trended. So we dropped as low as actually 30% of pre-COVID levels when the lockdowns were in effect. So that was just for a couple months. And then it steadily kind of grew back up to the 40-50% range. So it didn't pop from 40% up to 60% from July to August, which was Zero Fare for Better Air last year. But we did see, just if you look kind of that trend, it did bump up on our recurring ridership. And you have to there's all these nuances, right? So we have paratransit services that popped up a little bit more than the rest of our services. There's non-revenue services like our mall shuttle that we took out of that calculation, et cetera. So it wasn't a clean 20% per se.
And final question, where is ridership trending in 2023 so far?
We're still maintaining about that 60% pre-COVID level, and we're trying to get away. That's just a good way to put it in context. We're trying to get away from comparing it to pre-COVID because it's changed so much. So just for discussion purposes, I would say now that we see that trend really kind of sticking where it is at the level that it is currently and has been for many, many months, I think that's kind of where we expect it to be. And part of it too that would impact some of the ridership is we implemented a system optimization plan. So a lot of things changed to where it's really hard to have an apples to apples comparison pre and post COVID.
Okay, thank you.
Director Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thanks for that discussion. And Mr. Ohlenberger, one thing I wanted to note just in that, it's a great line of questioning. And I think as we think about the finances going forward, one of the major risks to the agency that we've talked about on the board for a couple of years now and are starting to look even more closely at is the dependency on one revenue source. I mean, even those small moves in fare revenue just further amplify the fact that we're so dependent on just the sales and use tax source of revenue. So one thing I wanted to note about the Zero Fare last year is we did get a report that went through just a statistical analysis of the response to it and the increase in ridership. And as Mr. McLeod was highlighting, largely it was very difficult to get the comparison. One thing that was interesting to me was the analysis on whether there was elasticity of demand. This has always been a question in my mind here, and it's very hard to measure in transit, as I've come to find out. There was only one area where elasticity was, you could really point to the data and somewhat confidently say there's some elasticity of demand in there, which was in our paratransit services. So in other words, with the lower cost, having that increase was a pretty clear correlation in paratransit. I do think that represents an opportunity long-term for the agency for us to be thinking about what types of partners we might pursue. And so, Mr. Ohlenberger, for the sake of the record, and also since we're discussing financial risk here, we have started talking about a pilot program that we're working on right now for Zero Fare for Youth. And there's a long-term opportunity with that to try to seek partners. The agency could do a short-term pilot of this to really explore elasticity and explore how we respond. But it also represents an opportunity to perhaps bring in partners that could bring in alternative funding to sustain something like that. So paratransit was one thing from that zero fare that stuck out, in at least in my mind, is another area we might want to explore down the road for the same reason. So anyway, I think for this group, it's good just to think about as we're looking at financial risk to the agency, expecting that demand to stay about where it is, I think is reasonable. And then measuring things we can do to adjust demand from the levels we're at right now is something we should probably keep an eye on. So anyway, just figured I'd note some of those things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Catlin.
Thank you. I would just wanted to add that Director Davidson had put together a kind of a white paper on some of these strategies for alternative funding that might be helpful to share with our non-director audit committee members. So I found that to be really quite useful as we move forward.
Yeah, does the board office need that to be re-forwarded to distribute out to the committee?
I would appreciate it, but
Director Davidson, would you mind just sending that to board office, pop it to the top of their inbox, and then we can get that distributed out?
Yeah, if it's a document I'm thinking of, I'll send that. If I don't send the right one, let me know. And also, I think we'll have more. I think we'll have better things to share moving forward as we start to formalize some of the efforts. I think the Finance and Planning Committee will get some opportunities to hear from Mr. McLeod about suggested approaches to even digging in deeper on that. So I can share that out, but it was just really from the brainstorm from our retreat. And so I think it contains some just some free thinking that isn't well refined, but I'll find that and I'll forward that to the board office.
I still thought it was a great start and kind of along the lines of what you were sharing with Mr. Olenberger. I just think it would be helpful.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion on this item? Is there further presentation? Looks like it's the end. Okay, I am going to call for the vote. Are there any no votes? With 4 in favor, 0 no's, and 1 absent, the motion carries. Are there any other matters to come before the audit committee? Great. Seeing and hearing none, we are adjourned as of 1:55 p.m. Thank you everyone so much for your time. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank
everyone.
you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome work. Thanks, team.
Thank you.